For thousands of years, execution was more than just death. It was a spectacle of cruelty, designed to terrorize and control. From impalement to burning alive, ancient civilizations invented horrifying methods that would send shivers down your spine even today. Join me as we uncover the brutal truths behind history's most terrifying executions. Throughout human history, execution has served purposes far beyond simply ending a life. In ancient civilizations, execution was a deliberate and public act designed to send powerful messages, to instill fear, assert authority, and maintain social order. Far from being a private or clinical procedure, execution was often a spectacle, performed in front of crowds who witnessed the ultimate punishment for crimes, rebellion, or betrayal. In many ancient societies, the act of execution held deep cultural and religious significance. It was not just a form of justice, but a ritual that reinforced the prevailing values and power structures. For rulers and governments, public executions were tools to demonstrate their control, showing that disobedience and dissent would be met with merciless consequences. The methods chosen for execution were carefully designed to amplify this effect. The brutality of the punishment was meant to strike terror into the hearts of the people, a warning that no one was above the law or the ruler's will. This is why many ancient execution methods were not quick or painless, but drawn out and agonizing, maximizing physical and psychological suffering. From the scorching pyres of ancient cultures to the brutal impalements and public crucifixions, each method reflected the unique blend of beliefs, fears, and power dynamics of its time. These executions were also often accompanied by ceremonies, prayers, or chants, transforming them into events that blurred the line between justice and theater. Moreover, public executions served to reinforce the social hierarchy. The powerful could exercise their authority visibly, while the condemned became examples, often dehumanized and stripped of dignity, to remind the masses of their place in society. Punishments could vary drastically depending on one's status. Nobility might be beheaded swiftly, while commoners suffered prolonged tortures. As you journey with me through this video, we will explore 10 of the most horrifying execution methods from ancient times. Each one reveals not just the cruelty of the past, but also the complex ways in which societies used pain and death as instruments of control and communication. Understanding these brutal practices helps us reflect on the evolution of justice and human rights. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about humanity's capacity for cruelty and the importance of progress toward more humane treatment of those accused or convicted of crimes. So brace yourself. The stories ahead are not easy to hear, but they shine a harsh light on the darkest chapters of our collective past, the horrifying truth behind ancient execution methods. Segment 2. Crucifixion, the ultimate public humiliation and torture. Among the many brutal execution methods developed by ancient civilizations, crucifixion stands out as one of the most infamous and horrifying. It was designed not only to kill but to inflict maximum pain and humiliation over a prolonged period, often lasting hours or even days. Rooted deeply in the Roman Empire's system of control, crucifixion became a chilling symbol of suffering and public terror. Crucifixion likely originated earlier, with roots in Persian and Carthaginian practices, but it was the Romans who perfected and institutionalized it. It was primarily used for slaves, rebels, and the lowest classes and people deemed the most dangerous threats to Roman authority. The method's cruelty was intended to break the spirit as much as the body. The process began with the condemned forced to carry the heavy crossbeam, known as the patibulum, under the execution site, often a public place like a roadside or city outskirts. This journey was itself a brutal ordeal, exposing the victim to humiliation and exhaustion. Once at the site, the victim was either nailed or tied to the wooden cross. Nails were driven through the wrists and feet, causing unbearable pain and making escape impossible. The weight of the body pulling down made breathing increasingly difficult, leading to a slow suffocation. Victims would hang there exposed to the elements, mocked by crowds, and left to die a slow, agonizing death. The psychological torment was as cruel as the physical. The condemned endured the public's jeers and scorn, often without any hope of mercy or rescue. Families and friends might be forced to watch, adding emotional anguish to the physical suffering. Crucifixion served not just as execution but as a warning. Roman authorities used it to deter rebellion and crime, by making the punishment a spectacle of terror. The position of the crosses was strategic, often along well-traveled roads, ensuring that the message of Roman power and justice reached far and wide. One of the most famous crucifixions in history is that of Jesus of Nazareth, whose death by crucifixion has profound religious and cultural significance. His story highlights both the brutal nature of the punishment and its enduring impact on human consciousness. Despite its cruelty, crucifixion was horrifyingly effective. Death could take days, depending on the victim's strength and the manner of execution. Causes of death included shock, dehydration, asphyxiation, and heart failure. Eventually, crucifixion was outlawed as a form of execution, seen as too barbaric even by later Roman standards. Yet its legacy remains, reminding us of a time when execution was designed to maximize pain, fear, and public control. Segment 3, Impalement, a slow and gruesome death. Among the most terrifying execution methods used in ancient times, impalement stands out for its sheer brutality and slow, agonizing death it inflicted on victims. Unlike executions that aimed for a quicker end, impalement was designed to prolong suffering and send a chilling message of terror to enemies and populations alike. Impalement involved driving a sharp wooden or metal stake through a person's body, typically entering through the lower body and exiting near the upper torso or neck. The exact positioning and technique varied by culture and era, but the purpose was always the same: to cause excruciating pain and a prolonged, humiliating death. The origins of impalement can be traced back to ancient Assyria and Persia, where it was used as a method of punishment for traitors, criminals, or prisoners of war. The infamous ruler Vlad the Impaler of 15th century, Wallachia, modern-day Romania, famously employed this horrific method on thousands, giving the practice its notorious name. Victims were often left impaled in public spaces, exposed to the elements, animals, and the gaze of terrified onlookers. Death could take hours or even days, depending on how the stake was placed and the victim's resilience. The slow agony served as both punishment and gruesome warning, reinforcing the ruler's absolute power. The physical torment was unimaginable. The stake would pierce vital organs or cause massive internal injuries, but because it often missed the heart or major arteries, death was delayed. Victims suffered intense pain, shock, dehydration, and infection as they hung impaled. Beyond the physical torture, the psychological horror was immense. Being displayed like this in public shattered a person's dignity and instilled fear in the population. The knowledge that such a fate awaited those who defied the ruler or broke the law kept many in submission. Impalement was also used as a tool of war and intimidation. Armies would impale captured enemies or rebels and leave their bodies on display along roads and borders, sending a brutal message of deterrence to anyone considering resistance. Though extremely barbaric, impalement reflects the dark realities of ancient justice systems, where cruelty and spectacle were intertwined. It is a stark reminder of how fear and pain were wielded as instruments of control. In modern times, impalement is universally condemned as a grotesque violation of human rights, but the chilling legacy remains, etched into history as one of the most horrifying execution methods ever devised. Segment 4. Burning at the stake. Fire as purification and punishment. One of the most terrifying and dramatic methods of execution in ancient and medieval times was burning at the stake. This horrific punishment combined physical agony with symbolic meaning, as fire was seen not only as a tool of death, but also as a purifier, believed to cleanse evil and sin from the condemned soul. Burning at the stake has roots that stretch back thousands of years, appearing in various ancient cultures including the Greeks, Romans, and later the Christian and European medieval worlds. It was often reserved for those accused of heresy, witchcraft, or crimes deemed deeply offensive to the social or religious order. The process was brutal and public. Victims were tied to a large wooden stake, sometimes with dry brush or kindling piled around their feet to help ignite the flames. The execution would often take place in town squares or other communal spaces, turning the death into a spectacle for the watching crowd. The physical pain of burning alive was unimaginable. As flames licked the flesh, the victim experienced intense heat, severe burns, and eventually suffocation from inhaling smoke and toxic gases. Death could be quick if the flames reached vital organs early, but often it was a slow and excruciating process lasting many agonizing minutes. Beyond the physical torment, burning at the stake carried a powerful psychological and spiritual message. In Christian Europe, fire symbolized purification and divine judgment, so the execution was framed as a way for the condemned to atone for their sins, a final, horrifying cleansing before death. Victims sometimes faced the crowd with courage, hoping for mercy or forgiveness, while others were overwhelmed by terror. Families, religious leaders, and authorities often attended, reinforcing the communal nature of the event. One of the most famous historical instances of burning at the stake was the execution of Joan of Arc, the French heroine condemned for heresy in the 15th century. Her death became a powerful symbol of injustice and martyrdom, highlighting the complex political and religious dynamics behind such executions. Burning at the stake was also widely used during the European witch hunts from the 15th to 17th centuries, when thousands, mostly women, were accused of witchcraft and executed in this terrifying manner. The executions served both as punishment and as a means to control and terrorize populations. Over time, as societies evolved and ideas about justice and humanity progressed, burning at the stake was increasingly viewed as barbaric and inhumane. Eventually, it was abolished in most parts of the world, replaced by supposedly more humane methods of execution. However, the legacy of this brutal punishment remains a chilling testament to the lengths societies once went to maintain power, enforce religious orthodoxy, and control populations through fear. Burning at the stake reminds us of the dark intersection between cruelty, belief, and spectacle in human history, a horrifying truth about how fire, one of humanity's earliest tools, was turned into an instrument of terror and death. Segment 5, Breaking on the Wheel, Prolonged Agony as Public Spectacle. Among the most gruesome and barbaric execution methods from ancient and medieval times is the breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel. This horrific device was designed to inflict prolonged pain and public humiliation, making it one of the most feared punishments of its era. The breaking wheel consisted of a large wooden wheel, often similar to those found on carts or wagons. The condemned prisoner would be tied or nailed to the wheel, stretched out so that their limbs could be methodically broken. Executioners used heavy iron bars or hammers to shatter the bones of the arms and legs, sometimes in a prearranged pattern that left the victim conscious but helpless. Unlike many executions that aimed for a swift death, breaking on the wheel was deliberately slow and torturous. The pain was excruciating and lasted for hours or even days, depending on the cruelty of the executioner and the will of the victim. Often, after the bones were broken, the wheel with the body was mounted on a tall pole or placed in a public area for all to see, a grim warning to anyone who might challenge authority or break the law. The social and psychological impact of this punishment was immense. The spectacle was intended to terrorize the population, deterring crime and rebellion through fear. It was also a tool of humiliation, stripping the condemned of dignity and making their suffering a public event. Historically, the breaking wheel was used across Europe, particularly in France, Germany, and Eastern Europe. From the Middle Ages well into the early modern period, the device was associated with particularly heinous crimes such as murder, robbery, or treason. Its use was sometimes codified in law, marking it as a state-sanctioned form of terror. Some victims were given a merciful death by a final blow to the head, known as the coup de grâce, but many were left to die slowly from shock, blood loss, or exposure. The gruesome images of shattered limbs and helpless victims hanging from poles became a terrifying symbol of medieval justice. The breaking wheel also entered cultural memory through stories and legends, such as that of Saint Catherine of Alexandria, who was said to have been sentenced to this form of execution. According to legend, the wheel broke when she touched it, a miracle that saved her, but she was later martyred by beheading. Over time, the cruelty of the breaking wheel came to be seen as barbaric even by contemporary standards. and its use was gradually abolished. However, it remains a stark reminder of how justice systems once embraced torture as both punishment and deterrent. The legacy of the breaking wheel reveals a dark chapter in human history where pain, power, and public spectacle combined in terrifying ways. It forces us to reflect on how societies have evolved in their understanding of justice, humanity, and the limits of cruelty. Segment 6: Beheading, Swift Justice or Spectacle. Beheading is one of the oldest and most well-known methods of execution throughout history. It has been used across many ancient civilizations, from the Egyptians and Persians to the Romans and beyond. At first glance, beheading might seem like a more merciful and swift way to end a life, especially compared to other brutal methods. However, it was far more complex than a simple quick death, often carrying its own symbolism and spectacle. The act of beheading involves severing the head from the body, usually with a sword, axe, or later with the invention of the guillotine. In many cultures, the head was seen as the seat of the soul, identity, and consciousness. Thus, the removal of the head was both a literal and symbolic act, permanently erasing the person's identity and status. Historically, beheading was often reserved for the nobility or higher classes, seen as a more honorable death, compared to torturous executions for common criminals. Kings, queens, and nobles faced the blade in public ceremonies that combined justice with ritual. The public spectacle of beheading served multiple purposes. It was a warning, a demonstration of power, and sometimes even a macabre form of entertainment. One of the most infamous beheadings in history is that of King Louis XVI during the French Revolution. The guillotine, invented as a supposedly humane and efficient execution device, became a symbol of revolutionary justice, but also of terror. The swift drop of the blade was designed to minimize pain. Yet the mass executions using the guillotine created a chilling atmosphere of fear and control. Before the guillotine, executioners used swords or axes, which required skill to perform a clean and quick cut. A botched beheading could mean prolonged suffering and humiliation for the condemned. In some cultures, elaborate rituals surrounded the execution to uphold the dignity of both the victim and the authority. The psychological impact of beheading went beyond the condemned. The display of severed heads was common. Rulers would mount the heads of enemies or traitors on spikes or walls to warn others. This practice sent a clear message about the consequences of betrayal or rebellion. Beheading also had a deep religious or spiritual dimension. In some societies, it was believed that the severed head retained power or significance, leading to rituals involving the head after death. In others, the act was seen as necessary to release the soul. While it may seem more humane compared to other brutal executions, beheading was a calculated form of control and terror. The public nature, symbolism, and finality combined to make it a powerful tool in ancient justice systems. Over time, as societies moved toward less violent punishments, beheading became largely obsolete, though it still exists in some parts of the world today, often condemned by international law. Understanding beheading's role in history reveals the complex relationship between death, power, and symbolism, reminding us how execution methods reflected cultural values as much as practical needs. Segment 7: Stoning, Community Execution and Collective Violence. Stoning is one of the oldest and most communal forms of execution known to human history. Unlike many other methods that rely on specialized executioners or instruments, stoning involves the collective participation of a community in delivering the punishment. This form of execution not only ended a life, but served as a public declaration of social and moral boundaries. Historically, stoning appears in ancient legal codes, including the Code of Hammurabi, and is notably referenced in religious texts, such as the Torah and the Quran. It was commonly used as a punishment for crimes, like adultery, blasphemy, apostasy, or other offenses deemed deeply threatening to the moral fabric of society. The process of stoning is brutally simple yet merciless. The condemned individual is typically placed in a public space, often buried up to their waist or chest to immobilize them, and then pelted with stones by members of the community until death occurs. The stones varied in size, but even small stones could cause fatal injuries when hurled repeatedly. The power of stoning lies in its communal nature. It involves the collective responsibility of society in enforcing laws and moral codes. Every participant in the act becomes complicit in the punishment, reinforcing social cohesion and shared values. This collective violence sends a potent message that the community will not tolerate violations of its most sacred rules. Psychologically, stoning serves to ostracize and dehumanize the condemned. The victim's death is not only physical but symbolic, a way to purge what the community sees as contamination or threat. The execution becomes a ritualistic cleansing, reaffirming the community's unity and order. In some ancient societies, stoning was also accompanied by religious rituals, prayers or chants, further emphasizing the sacred nature of the act. It was both a legal and spiritual punishment. Despite its ancient origins, stoning has persisted into modern times in certain parts of the world, often sparking international outrage and human rights debates. The method is widely condemned for its cruelty, public nature, and potential for abuse or miscarriage of justice. The legacy of stoning highlights how societies have used execution not just to punish individuals but to bind communities together through shared acts of violence and moral judgment. Understanding stoning forces us to confront the complex dynamics of justice, violence, and social order, and challenges modern societies to reflect on how far we've come and how much remains to be done in the pursuit of humane justice. Segment 8. Dismemberment. Terror through mutilation. Dismemberment is one of the most brutal forms of execution, involving the deliberate tearing apart of the human body, limb by limb. Unlike executions that aim to swiftly end life, dismemberment was designed to maximize terror, pain, and public humiliation. It sent a horrifying message about the power of rulers and the consequences of defiance. Historically, dismemberment has been practiced in various cultures around the world, often reserved for the most serious crimes such as treason, rebellion, or heinous acts against the state or religion. The method could take many forms: cutting off limbs one by one, quartering the body, or tying a person to multiple horses, pulling in opposite directions, a practice known as drawing and quartering in medieval England. The physical suffering caused by dismemberment was extreme. Victims endured unimaginable pain as their bodies were mutilated while still alive, often screaming in agony. This method was also a form of psychological torture. The anticipation of each new wound added to the horror. Dismemberment was usually carried out in public spaces to maximize the spectacle. Crowds gathered to witness the punishment, which served as both entertainment and a stark warning. The display of torn bodies was intended to shock and terrify onlookers, reinforcing the ruler's authority and deterring others from crime or rebellion. Beyond punishment, dismemberment carried deep symbolic meaning. In some cultures, the dismemberment of a body was thought to prevent the soul from resting or to punish the individual in the afterlife. It was also a way to erase the identity of the condemned, reducing them to scattered pieces rather than a whole person. One notorious example is the English practice of drawing and quartering, used for high treason. The condemned would be dragged to the execution site, hanged but cut down before death, then disemboweled, beheaded, and finally cut into 4 parts. Each quarter was often displayed in different parts of the kingdom. As a grim message, dismemberment was not only a method of execution but also a psychological weapon aimed at breaking the spirit of the condemned and those who witnessed it. Its brutality etched itself into collective memory and historical records as one of the darkest forms of human cruelty. Today, dismemberment is universally condemned and considered a grave violation of human rights. But its legacy forces us to remember the extremes to which power and fear once drove societies. Segment 9. Hanging. From execution to public warning. Hanging is one of the most historically widespread methods of execution, used by countless cultures and societies throughout the ancient and medieval worlds. While today it is often seen as a more humane form of execution, the reality of hanging in its earlier forms was brutal and carried heavy symbolic weight as a public act of justice and terror. The method of hanging involves suspending the condemned person by the neck from a rope or cord until death occurs. However, the way hanging was carried out varied dramatically depending on time and place. In many early forms, death was slow and agonizing, caused by strangulation as the victim's airway closed and blood flow was cut off. One key development was the introduction of the long drop technique in the 19th century, designed to break the neck quickly and cause instant death. But before that, hangings could last many minutes, with victims gasping and struggling for breath while suspended. Hanging served multiple purposes. It was a form of capital punishment for a wide range of crimes, from theft to murder and treason. More importantly, it was a public event, a grim spectacle meant to instill fear and reinforce authority. Executions took place in town squares or gallows erected in visible areas where crowds gathered to witness justice. In some societies, the condemned's body was left hanging for extended periods after death as a warning. This hanging in chains or gibbeting displayed the corpse as a stark deterrent to others, showing the consequences of crime or rebellion. The symbolism of hanging went beyond punishment. The very act of suspending a person between earth and sky was seen as a form of spiritual or social limbo. It represented shame, disgrace, and the severing of one's ties to the community. Hanging was also used as a tool of political control. In times of unrest, rulers would order mass hangings of rebels or dissenters to terrorize populations and crush opposition. Despite its prevalence, hanging was not without controversy. The slow deaths and potential for botched executions led to public discomfort and calls for reform. This eventually resulted in more humane methods and legal safeguards in many countries. Today, hanging is largely abolished or restricted, but its historical role as a tool of justice and terror remains a dark reminder of humanity's past. Segment 10. Legacy and Reflection. What ancient executions teach us today. As we look back at these horrifying execution methods from ancient times, it's clear that they were far more than just ways to end life. Each method was carefully crafted to instill fear, demonstrate power, and maintain control over societies through pain and public spectacle. These brutal practices reveal a dark side of human history, where justice was inseparable from cruelty, and punishment was often a tool of terror rather than reform. The legacy of ancient executions lingers in many ways. They shape the development of legal and justice systems, forcing societies to grapple with the balance between punishment and humanity. Over centuries, the shockingly cruel methods like crucifixion, impalement, and burning at the stake gradually gave way to ideas about dignity, fairness, and eventually human rights. Modern justice systems, in many parts of the world, have evolved dramatically, rejecting torture and inhumane punishment. The death penalty itself is increasingly controversial, with many countries abolishing it altogether. Yet, understanding the terrifying past helps us appreciate these advancements and reminds us why progress is essential. These ancient execution methods also remind us of the dangers of power, unchecked by compassion or reason. When rulers and societies allow fear and cruelty to dictate justice, it often leads to suffering that extends far beyond the condemned, corroding the very fabric of community and morality. Moreover, the public spectacle of executions teaches us about the role of social control and collective psychology. Fear was weaponized to maintain order, but it also sowed distrust, resentment, and trauma. The echoes of these practices resonate in cultural memory and cautionary tales passed down through generations. Reflecting on this brutal history encourages us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and governance. It challenges us to build systems that protect justice without sacrificing dignity, and to resist the temptation of cruelty as a means of control. Ultimately, the horrifying truths behind ancient execution methods are not just stories of pain and death. They are lessons, stark warnings, from history about the costs of barbarity and the urgent need for compassion and humanity in justice. You hear a child cry, but no one stops it. In ancient temples, those cries were sacred, the sound of a life being offered to the gods. This isn't myth, it's real. Across empires and continents, children were buried alive, not as punishment, but as praise. When we think of ancient civilizations, we picture pyramids, golden idols, and celestial rituals under starlit skies. But beneath that beauty, something far darker was happening. A truth buried under thousands of years of silence and stone. The systematic sacrifice of children, not as a punishment, not as a mistake, but as a gift to the gods. To us, it's unthinkable, but to many ancient cultures, it was holy. These weren't fringe cults or isolated madmen. These were entire empires in the Inca, The Aztecs, the Carthaginians, the Shang of China, the Moche of Peru, and across continents and centuries, they shared one terrifying belief. The gods demanded innocence, and there was no innocence purer than a child. In a world ruled by fear of storms, famine, drought, disease, people were desperate to make sense of suffering. And when crops failed or floods came or enemies attacked, the answer often pointed skyward. The gods are angry. And if the gods were angry, someone had to pay. But why children? Because children were seen as spiritually pure, untainted by sin, and the most valuable offering a family could make. Their sacrifice wasn't seen as murder. It was seen as divine obedience. And for parents often poor and powerless, giving a child was a terrifying kind of honor, or a crushing submission to societal pressure. The act itself varied by culture. Some burned, some buried, some left children on mountain peaks or bound them in tombs beside dead kings. In every case, the message was the same. Take this life and spare ours. And it wasn't hidden. In some places, the rituals were public. Communities gathered. Priests sang. Incense burned. Children were dressed in white. Some were drugged. Others wept. In many accounts, the tears of the child were considered part of the offering, especially in rain rituals, where crying symbolized the clouds. You might imagine that these rituals were rare, but archaeology tells a darker story. Thousands of small bones have been unearthed from sacred sites. In some temples, infant remains were stacked in layers, entire cemeteries dedicated solely to the young. This wasn't rare. It was ritualized, and for centuries, it was forgotten until researchers began uncovering the physical truth. Small skulls cracked in patterns, matching blunt force trauma, tiny teeth blackened by fire, child-sized remains curled in fetal positions in sealed ritual pits. So why does this matter today? Because it forces us to confront something we don't like to admit, that the line between faith and fear, devotion and destruction, was once so thin that entire civilizations stepped across it, with their own children in their arms. This is not myth. This is not exaggeration. This is history. And in the next segment, we travel to one of the most chilling places on Earth, where thousands of urns still whisper of children, burned alive in the name of power. In the ancient city of Carthage, overlooking the Mediterranean Sea, stood a sacred space shrouded in beauty and soaked in blood. It was called the Tophet, a ceremonial burial ground filled with urns, altars, and ash. But these weren't the remains of honored elders or fallen warriors. They were the tiny bones of burned infants and toddlers, sacrificed by fire to the gods. Carthage was a powerful Phoenician city, rivaling Rome in wealth, trade, and military force. But beneath its greatness lay a chilling practice that has haunted historians and archaeologists for centuries: systematic child sacrifice. The ritual was simple and horrifying. When Carthaginians faced crisis, plague, famine, war, they turned to their deities, Baal Hammon and Tanit, god and goddess of storms, fertility, and fate. And to earn their favor, people brought their firstborn children to be sacrificed. Not criminals, not enemies, their own sons and daughters. Ancient texts describe the rituals in terrifying detail. The child would be placed into the hands of a bronze statue of Baal, often with the fire burning inside. As drums pounded and the crowd sang, the statue's arms tilted, letting the child fall into the flames. Some accounts claim the priests chanted loudly to drown out the screams. For centuries, scholars debated whether this was propaganda, stories invented by Carthage's enemies, especially the Romans. But then came the Tophet. Archaeologists uncovered thousands of urns buried in layers beneath the city. Inside each were charred bones of infants and small animals, sometimes mixed together, often accompanied by carved stone markers, inscribed with dedications to Baal and Tanit. These were not mass graves from disease or disaster. They were ritual deposits, carefully placed, generation after generation. The scale was staggering. Some estimates suggest over 20,000 children may have been sacrificed during Carthage's reign. And this wasn't just a fringe ritual. It was institutional. Wealthy families, political elites, and religious leaders all took part. In fact, it was believed that the more valuable the offering, the greater the divine reward. So why did they do it? Because Carthaginians believed that sacrifice wasn't cruelty, it was currency. Offering something precious could protect the city, bless the harvest, or turn the tide of war. And there was nothing more precious than a child. It's easy to judge from the modern world, but to them, it was holy, necessary, even noble. And perhaps most disturbing of all, some parents volunteered. They didn't resist. They didn't hide their children. They believed that this suffering would save the rest, that their sacrifice would echo into eternity. Today, the Tophet stands as a haunting reminder, a field of silent stones, each one marking a child given to fire. There are no names, no stories, just ashes and questions. How far will a civilization go to please its gods? And how many children must vanish before we call it what it truly was? High in the freezing Andes Mountains, at altitudes where the air is thin and death comes quietly, archaeologists made one of the most disturbing discoveries in modern history. Children perfectly preserved in ice, their faces still frozen in fear, their bodies untouched by time. These were not victims of nature. They were sacrifices, chosen by the mighty Inca Empire and offered to the gods on sacred peaks. This practice was called capacocha, and it is one of the most chilling examples of ritual sacrifice ever recorded. The Inca ruled over the largest empire in pre-Columbian America, with sprawling cities, advanced engineering, and a highly structured religion. They believed that the mountains, apus, were sacred spirits, and when drought, famine, or political transition struck, the people believed the gods needed blood, not just any blood, but the purest. That meant children. The victims were often young girls and boys, chosen from noble families, seen as beautiful, healthy, and untouched by sin. Being selected was considered a high honor. Some parents even felt pride. But the children? They were taken far from home, dressed in ceremonial clothes, and marched thousands of feet into the sky to die alone in the snow. What's horrifying is how organized the ritual was. The chosen children were treated well before their deaths, given fine food, honored garments, and even intoxicating substances. Scientists have found traces of coca leaves and alcohol in their systems, likely used to sedate them. Then, once on the mountaintop, they were buried alive, in sitting positions, inside small stone chambers. Some were left to freeze in the cold. Others were struck on the head to speed the process. And here's what makes it truly chilling. The bodies never decayed. Because of the freezing temperatures and low oxygen, many of these sacrificed children have been found completely intact. Skin, hair, even internal organs preserved. You can still see the expressions on their faces. Some look peaceful, others look terrified. One of the most famous is La Doncella, the maiden found in Argentina in 1999. She was 15 years old. When discovered, she looked like she had just fallen asleep. Her hair braided, her face serene. But CT scans revealed a different story. She had a lung infection. She was sick, and she knew. Other remains show evidence of blunt trauma, malnutrition, and long ceremonial preparation. These weren't random deaths. They were ritualized executions of the innocent, ordered by the empire, sanctified by priests, and forgotten by history. Why did they do it? Because the Incas believed the child's spirit would become divine, a messenger between the human world and the gods. But in truth, they were silenced forever. And today, we can still look into their eyes, frozen in snow for centuries, and wonder what they felt in those final, silent hours. What prayers they whispered, what goodbyes they never got to say. When we think of ancient Mesopotamia, we imagine towering ziggurats, clay tablets, and the dawn of civilization. But buried beneath the foundations of those cities, beneath homes, temples, and palaces, archaeologists discovered something darker than invention or art: the bones of children. Small, fragile skeletons placed beneath walls and thresholds, not victims of disease, but offerings. This wasn't an accident. It was ritual, an early and deeply rooted practice known as foundation sacrifice. Across Mesopotamia, in Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria, builders, believed that new structures required more than brick and mortar. They needed spiritual protection, and to ensure that a building would stand strong against time, invaders, and divine wrath. They made sacrifices, sometimes animals, and sometimes human beings. The belief was simple but chilling. Sacrifice something valuable to make the structure sacred. And in many cases, the most valuable thing was a child. Tiny graves have been found beneath doorways, under temple corners, and sealed within walls. In several cases, the positioning of the bodies is deliberate, curled into fetal poses, surrounded by grave goods like small bowls or amulets. In others, they're bound in cloth and placed inside jars, as if prepared for death long before the building was completed. The victims weren't chosen randomly. Evidence suggests they were young, unblemished, and pure, qualities that made them worthy to guard the structure. The belief was that their souls would protect the building from collapse, fire, or spiritual intrusion. In a way, the child became the eternal watchman, sacrificed in life to defend stone and brick. One of the most famous examples comes from Tel Asmar, an ancient Sumerian site. Beneath a temple floor, archaeologists found the skeletons of several infants arranged deliberately. The walls above them still bore the marks of religious symbols, as if the structure itself was infused with the souls of the sacrificed. Other sites revealed even more haunting clues. At Ur, one of the oldest cities in the world, dozens of child-sized burial jars were found beneath residential houses. Some were accompanied by inscriptions asking the gods for protection. Imagine building a home, laying bricks, and then placing your child beneath it to ensure it stood strong. This wasn't about cruelty for pleasure. It was about control over fate, nature, and divine forces. In a world where floods could wipe out a city overnight, and gods were believed to walk among men, the price of protection was often blood. And because these children were sacrificed during construction, they were literally entombed inside the buildings their deaths were meant to bless. Generations would live above them, unaware, or perhaps silently complicit. Because these weren't soldiers or rebels, they weren't condemned or guilty. They were children, killed not out of hate, but out of faith. And their tears, they were currency, spent by a desperate people to make the heavens weep. In the heart of ancient Mesoamerica, where towering temples scraped the sky and blood ran down pyramid steps, the Aztec Empire ruled with glory and terror. Most know about their human sacrifices, warriors, captives, priests offering their hearts to the sun. But hidden beneath the roar of the crowd and the clang of obsidian blades was a far more haunting ritual, the sacrifice of crying children to summon the rain. This wasn't rare. It was annual, and it was sacred. The Aztecs believed the rain god Tlaloc demanded tears, not metaphorical sorrow, but real physical tears from children. Without them, Tlaloc would withhold his blessing. Crops would die, the earth would crack, famine would come. So to avoid disaster, the priests gathered the young. The victims were usually very young children, sometimes infants, but often toddlers between 3 and 7 years old. They were chosen for their beauty, health, and innocence. Some were slaves. Others were given by families hoping to honor the gods or earn favor in the afterlife. The ritual began with a procession. The children were dressed in white robes and adorned with flower garlands. Some were made to wear paper headdresses or small figurines of Tlaloc. They were paraded through the city on litters or led by hand, surrounded by music, incense, and ceremonial chants. But here's where the horror begins. The priests wanted the children to cry. They believed the sound of tears was a signal to the rain god. It was said that the more the children wept, the more generous the rains would be. And if the children didn't cry on their own, the priests would encourage them, through fear, isolation, and sometimes physical discomfort. Imagine a child barely old enough to speak, surrounded by masked men, looming temples, and crowds of strangers, knowing something was wrong, but not understanding why. The ritual culminated on mountaintops, lakesides, or at sacred altars. There the children were killed, sometimes through drowning, to symbolically offer them to the waters, and sometimes by removing the heart, a common Aztec method of sacrifice. Their bodies were then buried in sacred fields or caves believed to be linked to the gods. Archaeologists have confirmed these accounts. At Tlalocan, near the great temple of Tenochtitlan, the remains of dozens of children were found, many buried in groups, some showing signs of ritual drowning. Inscriptions and artifacts confirm they were dedicated to Tlaloc. The Aztecs didn't see this as cruelty. It was cosmic balance. To them, life was a cycle of giving and taking, and the gods gave only when they received. But to modern eyes, it's almost unbearable, because these weren't soldiers or rebels. They weren't condemned or guilty. They were children, killed not out of hate, but out of faith. And their tears? They were currency, spent by a desperate people to make the heavens weep. On the arid northern coast of ancient Peru, long before the Inca rose to power, a mysterious and powerful civilization thrived, the Moche. They left behind intricate pottery, massive adobe pyramids, and mass graves. But these weren't graves for soldiers or criminals. Many were for children, buried alive next to the corpses of warriors, priests, and noble elites. In Moche culture, death wasn't the end. It was a journey, and the elite believed they wouldn't travel that path alone. Instead, they were accompanied by attendants, human beings sacrificed and buried with them, meant to serve in the next world. Among these attendants, children were common. Why children? Because they were seen as pure, loyal, and easily controlled, the perfect companions for the dead. The belief was that their spirits would assist, protect, or even entertain the elite in the afterlife. And so, when a powerful person died, they often took others with them, alive. Excavations at burial sites, like Huaca Rajada and Huaca de la Luna, have revealed chilling evidence. Tombs containing not just one body, but multiple, including small skeletons, curled at the feet or heads of adult corpses. In some cases, the children were clearly buried alive, positioned awkwardly, sometimes face down, with no grave goods of their own. They were offerings not mourned, but used. And it wasn't just one or two cases. Across dozens of tombs, archaeologists have found a pattern. The elite buried with ornaments, gold, ceremonial vessels. Next to them, a child or two, with no status, no name, and no sign of disease or injury. Many under the age of 10, some still bearing traces of textile wrappings or ritual dyes. One haunting discovery involved a child whose skeleton showed signs of struggling. Before death, arms twisted, head forced down, suggesting they may have been placed alive in a sealed tomb, with no light, no air, and no hope. The Moche weren't simply barbaric. They had a sophisticated understanding of astronomy, agriculture, and metallurgy. But their spiritual world was ruled by fear and blood. Their art often depicted scenes of sacrifice, throats being cut, captives bound, blood offered to gods, and they believed such rituals were not optional. They were survival. In their view, death was a transaction, and children were currency. They believed that by placing a child beside the corpse of a noble, they were guaranteeing that noble's passage into the next world, guarded, guided, and served by an innocent soul. And once sealed inside those tombs, no one ever heard them again. Today, the bones of those children remain, silent, still, placed in tombs not of their choosing, with people they never knew, for gods they couldn't understand. They weren't honored. They were silenced, forever. Ancient Egypt is often remembered for its grandeur, golden tombs, majestic pyramids, and the mystique of pharaohs who claimed to be gods. But behind the shimmering masks and sacred hieroglyphs lies a disturbing truth. Some royal tombs were sealed with the living, and among them were children, sacrificed not to honor the dead, but to serve them in the afterlife. Egyptians believed in eternity. To them, death wasn't an ending, but a continuation, and the afterlife mirrored the physical world. Pharaohs and high nobles expected to rule in death just as they had in life, and to maintain their power beyond the grave, they required servants, guards, and companions. That's where the children came in. While ancient Egyptian culture didn't widely embrace human sacrifice like the Aztecs or Carthaginians, there is undeniable evidence that, at certain times, particularly during the earliest dynasties, people, including children, were killed and buried with the elite. One of the most disturbing examples comes from Abydos, one of Egypt's oldest and most sacred necropolises. At the tomb of Pharaoh Jer, archaeologists discovered over 300 subsidiary graves surrounding the king's burial site. Many of the buried were young adults and children, placed neatly in rows, with no signs of disease or trauma that would suggest natural death. What's more chilling is the timing. All the burials appear to have occurred simultaneously, meaning that these individuals didn't die over time, but all at once. It's a clear sign of ritual sacrifice, likely to accompany the pharaoh into the afterlife. These weren't enemies or criminals. They were retainers, possibly slaves, servants, and children. The smallest skeletons, some not older than 6, were found without grave goods or inscriptions. Their purpose was clear: to follow the dead king into eternity. Later in Egypt's history, this practice became more symbolic, using figurines called ushabti to serve the dead. But in the earliest dynasties, the dead were literally buried with the living. Why children? Because, as in many ancient cultures, they were seen as obedient, pure, and disposable. A child could be trained to serve in life, and forced to serve in death. And for a pharaoh claiming divine authority, what was one more life sacrificed for cosmic order? There are even tomb paintings and inscriptions that hint at this practice, showing retinues of small figures surrounding the pharaoh, not as equals but as silent shadows. And what happened when that tomb was sealed? Nothing. No screams heard. No light returned. Just silence and darkness as those children lay beside the dead, breathing their last in sealed stone chambers. In a culture obsessed with life after death, some children were never given the chance to live at all. Their fate was decided not by illness or accident, but by ritual, power, and a belief that one man's eternity mattered more than their entire lives. In the shadowy dawn of Chinese civilization, where kings claimed power by divine right and the spirits of ancestors ruled daily life, the Shang dynasty, c. 1600 to 1046 BCE, carved its name into history, not just through bronze and warfare, but through blood. Beneath the surface of Shang cities, ritual pits were dug, filled not with grain or treasure, but with the remains of human beings, many of them children. In Shang culture, sacrifice wasn't occasional. It was constant, a structured, state-sanctioned system of slaughter that reached deep into every aspect of religion, governance, and cosmic order. And among the most helpless victims of this belief system were children, used as offerings to deities, royal ancestors, and the forces of fate itself. The evidence is overwhelming. In the ancient capital of Yinshu, archaeologists uncovered more than 13,000 human sacrifices, many placed in mass, burial pits around royal tombs. These weren't battlefield dead. They were civilians, controlled, chosen, killed in ritual. And among the many broken skeletons, small skulls and bones of children appeared again and again. Some were buried alone. Others were tossed in with adults. Some were beheaded or dismembered, their bones bearing cut marks or signs of blunt trauma. A few were placed in fetal positions, likely buried alive, sealed in clay-lined pits with no weapons, no tools, no chance. The purpose? To honor the ancestors, to appease the gods, to ensure royal authority was maintained through cosmic harmony. Shang rulers believed that the spiritual world and the human world were linked by blood, and the more precious the blood, the more powerful the magic. That meant children were not only acceptable offerings, they were ideal. Oracle bones, the earliest known Chinese written records, speak clearly of these sacrifices. Questions scratched into tortoise shells and cattle scapulae asked, should we sacrifice 10 humans? Shall we offer a child to the river god? Will the king's health improve if we bury a child at the altar? These weren't whispered doubts. They were state decisions, etched into history. And the number of children sacrificed wasn't trivial. In some tombs, the ratio of child to adult skeletons is startlingly high. At certain seasonal or royal events, dozens, even hundreds, of people were sacrificed, and children were frequently included in the ritual mix. Why? Because a child's death was seen as powerful. Their innocence was a gift, their silence sacred, and most haunting of all, this wasn't hidden. It was part of Shang identity. These deaths were staged, sanctioned, and remembered. Today, when we look at the bronze vessels, jade ornaments, and inscriptions left by Shang royalty, it's easy to marvel at their brilliance. But beneath every palace, every altar, every noble tomb, lie the bones of those who were never meant to grow up. The Shang didn't just bury children. They buried them as messages, written in blood, to gods that never answered. Off the coast of French Guiana, surrounded by shark-infested waters and cloaked in tropical decay, lies a haunted rock known to history as Devil's Island, a name that still drips with dread. From 1852 to 1953, it served as France's most brutal penal colony, infamous for its cruelty, disease, and madness. But what few people know is that children were sent there too, not as visitors, not as family, but as prisoners, and some of them were never seen again. This wasn't an ancient religious site. This was modern sacrifice, buried not under temples, but behind stone walls in cells with no mercy and no escape. Devil's Island was part of a larger network of prisons called the Îles du Salut, Islands of Salvation, a cruel name for a place designed to destroy human beings. The worst criminals, political dissidents, and undesirables were shipped there in chains. But over the years, so were young boys, often as young as 12 or 13, convicted of petty crimes or simply orphaned by war and poverty. What awaited them was not rehabilitation. It was slow living death. These boys, some of them barely taller than the rifles, carried by guards, were placed in adult prison blocks. There were no child-specific facilities, no protections. They lived among murderers, rapists, and revolutionaries. Diseases like malaria and dysentery swept the island. Food was scarce. Escape was suicide. And yet, they were kept there. Not for weeks or months, but for life. Why? Because the system didn't care. The prison was designed to be forgotten, a dumping ground for human refuse. Once you were sent there, your name vanished. And for a child without wealth or family, there was no hope of release. There are records of some of these boys. A 13-year-old accused of stealing bread, sentenced to 7 years of hard labor. A 15-year-old orphan sent for vagrancy, later found dead of fever in solitary confinement. Groups of boys used to clean latrines, dig graves, or serve older prisoners, physically and sexually abused, with no recourse. These children weren't sacrificed to gods. They were sacrificed to bureaucracy, indifference, and a system that valued punishment over humanity. Most died within a few years. Some were buried in unmarked graves. Others simply disappeared, their identities erased, their stories never told. The French government kept meticulous records of adult executions, but many of the children, forgotten. Even today, when tourists visit Devil's Island, they see the ruins of the prison chapel, the guard towers, the rusted gates, but they don't see the suffering carved into the walls, the desperate scratches from tiny fingers, the prayers never answered, the futures never allowed to begin. In the end, Devil's Island didn't need fire or altars to destroy innocence. All it needed was silence, stone, and the will to look away. We've traveled across continents, down into tombs, through blood-stained temples and forgotten islands. We've heard the whispers of children buried beneath stone, burned in sacred fires, frozen on mountaintops, and locked away to die. These were not myths. These were real sacrifices, committed by powerful cultures, justified by religion, law, empire, and fear. But the question that haunts us isn't just what happened, it's why, and what it says about us. At the core of every sacrifice we've explored lies a chilling truth. Human beings, no matter how advanced, spiritual or civilized, have always been capable of rationalizing horror. All it takes is belief. Belief in a god, belief in a system, belief that some lives matter more than others. In ancient Carthage, children were burned alive to keep cities safe. In the Inca Empire, they were left to freeze, their deaths wrapped in honor and ritual. In Mesopotamia, they were buried in building foundations to protect walls from crumbling. In Shang, China, their blood fed the spirits of dead kings. And in Devil's Island, they were thrown into a bureaucratic machine that fed on poverty and silence. These weren't acts of chaos or madness. They were organized, approved, and repeated. People believed they were doing the right thing, even as they led a child to die. And that should terrify us, because the most dangerous kind of evil is the kind that hides behind order, ritual, and purpose. When we look at these ancient practices, it's easy to feel distance, to say, that was long ago. We're better now. But the truth is more uncomfortable. We still live in a world where children suffer for the comfort of others, where power silences the powerless, where some lives are still considered expendable. just not with fire and altars, but with neglect, exploitation, and systemic failure. The tools may have changed, but the pattern remains. Every civilization leaves a legacy. Some are written in stone, others in ash and bone, and the children, the forgotten ones, rarely get to write their side of the story. But their bodies do. The urns, the pits, the sealed tombs, they speak in silence of a world where fear was stronger than love, and obedience was worth more than innocence. So as we close this journey, remember this. Civilizations that sacrifice their children, literally or metaphorically, may rise to greatness. But they carry a rot beneath their foundation, a rot that eventually crumbles stone, extinguishes empires, and echoes in history forever. Because the gods these children were given to never bled, never cried, never gave anything back. Only we are left to carry the guilt and ask the question no one in their time dared to ask. Was it ever worth it?